There it is, folks. All right, welcome to the, what's the word I'm looking for where it comes back, something comes back? The reboot.
The reboot, how about that?
Welcome to the reboot of a Talk to Remember podcast.
The rebirth.
I am your host, Ethan Truman. This is the second host,
DJ Doll,
aka Blake Beasy. And we decided we're going to come back with another podcast. Well, not with another podcast, but with bringing this podcast back, because not only do we like to talk about important shit all the time, but I've had people mention to me, yo, like, your guys' podcast was legit. And then I was thinking about, at the time, it didn't really seem very legit. Should I be, like, looking at the camera, or should we be talking? At the time, it didn't, like, it just seemed like fun, obviously, but I didn't really realize how professional it was, because as you can see with this photo, if you can see, it kind of looks like misty to you guys. I get that, but we had a nice setup in his old spot. Blake's got a new crib now, so
yeah,
that's what it is. And we are here bringing you guys episode, we can either call it episode 5 or 6 or whatever we were on 3 years ago.
I think it's 4.
How long ago was that we did that?
That was November of 2017.
He remembers the month. November of 2017, so remember, so like 2.5 years ago?
Yep.
If my math is halfway right. So 2.5 years. We are different places in life now. We've done things, been places, and we ended up here recording a podcast for you guys. So we didn't really write anything down.
No.
I figured just like with this reintroduction podcast, maybe we can just kind of like wing it, not make it too long.
Yeah.
Just like a quick 45 minutes or something. But let's catch them up on what's going on in the world, because our kids are going to watch this like 30 years from now.
Yeah.
So right now, just give
them...
They
might even ask us, and we'll be like, you know what? I have something for you.
Yeah.
And then we go to YouTube.
We pull up our podcast, and they'll be like, yo, this was my dad at 26 and 25. So you go ahead and give them a rundown of what's going on in the world, what year we're in, etc.
So it is June of 2020. I believe it is on May 24th of this year. Another unarmed black man by the name of George Floyd was murdered by a police officer who knelt on his neck for 9 minutes, 8 to 9 minutes.
It's like 8.5 minutes, something like that.
Yeah, he had the police called on him because he had supposedly used a counterfeit $20 bill, and where he tried to spend it, the cashier who worked there was young, and he was new to the job. He'd maybe been on the job for about 6 months. And he ended up calling the police on this guy named George Floyd. And later on down the road, the store owner had said in an interview that he usually trains his cashiers not to call the police in circumstances like that. And he's more, he's from the Middle East, I believe. And he's more about like his neighborhood and the people and protecting the people and stuff like that. So that was one thing I read recently, but
yeah, I didn't see that interview, but that's
a
valuable piece of information.
Yeah, because then you can think like, what if that kid was trained? You know, what if he had more experience on the job?
Mm-hmm.
What if he didn't call the cops?
So this was in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Did you mention that?
Yep. No.
Okay. Yeah, Minneapolis, Minnesota, the May of 2020. In this same year, currently in the same situation, we are going through a pandemic with COVID-19, coronavirus. I really don't have a whole bunch of statistics for you guys that are watching this 5-10 years down the road, or 30 years down the road, or even 2 years down the road, that are kind of like, oh, now I'm old enough to see what's going on, because maybe whoever's watching this was like 12 at the time and not really whatever. So, but I could tell you that what has happened with this virus that took over was something that we hadn't seen in our lifetimes, and I don't know, I haven't done my research well enough to know, has there ever been a martial law type lockdown? We're not on martial law, but has there been a type lockdown like that? Because like currently, the economy's starting to open back up. Cities are starting to open back up. But for the better half of 3 months, 4 months, businesses were closed. Restaurants were closed. You could get carry out. Grocery stores that were open 24 hours were only open from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. And now they started getting to like 9 p.m. But like Walmart, that's usually 24 hours. Meijer, that's usually 24 hours, is only they close at 6 to 8 p.m. And it's getting to the point right now where a lot of places are advising you to wear masks. So it's so weird that it's becoming normal. Everywhere you go now, it's like you don't even double take it. And I just feel like we're living through a big chapter in our history books that we literally can walk into a gas station and there's 7 people wearing masks.
Right.
And that's some shit that like last year you'd have been like, what the fuck is
right.
But now it's like, it's just normal.
Right. And I just want to say real quick that the idea of quarantining is not a new idea by any means. It actually goes back all the way back to biblical times. People who had leprosy, they would self-quarantine. The difference was back then, whenever people would quarantine, or all the way up until now, usually only the sick would be the ones to quarantine. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't require everyone else to quarantine as well. But I do think statistically, it's safe to say that what we thought the coronavirus was in mid to late March, having the statistics we've gathered in the past 6 to 8 weeks, COVID-19 hasn't really turned out to be what we originally thought it was. But we now know, like, we have the practice of like how we can more effectively deal with like pandemics in the future that could be a lot more deadly. Kind of like the Spanish flu of, what year was that? Do you remember?
The Spanish flu?
It was in the 1800s. I think it was in the early 1800s.
Are you sure?
Yeah, or maybe the late 1800s. But the Spanish flu...
Hey Siri, when was the Spanish flu?
It happened from February 1st, 1918 to April 1st, 19...
I almost said 1916. 1918.
Man, I'm way off.
You're good. 1918 was the Spanish flu.
So the Spanish flu, it mainly like targeted people who were young, like in their 20s, and it affected people who were young in a more extensive way, where it was a lot more of a concern. But coronavirus doesn't really seem to be as much as a concern for people who are young and don't have pre-existing health issues, like diabetes or just other like sicknesses like heart disease and stuff like that.
At first, the world was in disarray, and we were being told a shit ton of people are dying from this left and right, which was true. There were a lot of people dying, but upon further investigation, a lot of news channels and medical doctors were coming out and speaking on it, and nurses that were working on the front lines were speaking on it and saying, these people are dying. It could be of a natural cause, but if they have a symptom that could be COVID-19 related, they're marking it as a COVID death.
Yeah, the way they were really treating it was if you died and you had COVID in your bloodstream, COVID-19 was found, to be present within you at your time of death, they were marking it down as a coronavirus death.
When in reality, the recovery rate was much higher for it.
Yeah, and I don't think that's really an accurate way for us to be able to tell how many people have been fatally dying from COVID-19, because if you did the same thing with the influenza, and I'm not saying that COVID-19 and the flu are the same thing, I do think COVID is quite a bit worse than the flu, and it's much more of a concern. But if you did the same thing with the flu and counted flu deaths like that and saw, if they had flu in their bloodstream, we're going to mark it down as a flu death. The flu would be the leading cause of death in the world.
Right.
Way past heart disease.
Which is the leading cause of death.
Yeah, in the U.S. it is.
Yeah.
Maybe, probably even in the world too.
So that's pretty much what we've been living through for the past pretty much all of 2020, really, is when I believe mid-January was the first U.S. case. And since then it's just inflated, and then we were put on quarantine. Pretty much every city, for as far as I remember, every city was put on a quarantine, which means you can go out if you're an essential worker. My job was essential. labeled essential. I work at a distribution center, so where I live, my job was labeled essential. So I still went to work, and a lot of other people still went to work. Those that couldn't go to work because of this pandemic, that they had to stay at home, their jobs were not labeled essential. Restaurants, for example, a lot of things like that, they were essentially like temporarily laid off. So the unemployment rate hit. Do you know what the unemployment rate hit?
I think at one point it was like 28% or high 20s, low 30s. Like it spiked like pretty high.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the unemployment rate, but it was not as high as the Great Depression was, correct?
Yeah.
But it was getting there, and people were worried about that. Now we're back on the, I don't want to say, the downhill, I guess we could say.
Yeah.
But the unemployment was, a lot of people got unemployment, which was super helpful for a lot of families that otherwise would have got evicted, not been able to eat. So that's a good thing that kicked in, was the unemployment for the people that lost their jobs because of this. So anyways, that's what we've been living through. And now that we're on like the downhill slope of that, this thing with George Floyd happened, which Blake and I agreed that it's not necessarily like our place to speak much on.
Yeah, when I first asked you if you wanted to speak about it, you said no.
Yeah, because I'm very vocal about it to the people around me and on my social medias. I let people know where I stand, and I stand with the black community. But when it comes to putting something like this out, I also understand that two white kids maybe shouldn't be the people to report on this. You know what I'm saying? But we decided that we can at least let you know, and let the public know, and let everybody else know that we are in support. And we understand the underlying issue that's been going on since the early 1700s, obviously. Early 1600s, 17th century. But, yeah, so that's what happened. The George Floyd was murdered by police on camera. People recorded him on their phone. The officer, like Blake said, had his knee in the man's neck while he was on the ground. 2 or 3 other officers had their weight on the man's back. One officer played lookout and just stood like this and just wouldn't let nobody get by him, obviously. Now, here's the thing that, like, before we like really get into it, here's something that I was talking to a friend of mine that I made at work. His name's Chris. He's an African American, and I was talking to him about the situation, and he was asking me, why don't you think the people that were recording or standing there did anything about it? And I told him, my personal belief of why those people didn't do it is because those people were African American, and they know the result of trying to run at an officer or shove an officer off of somebody. That's something that, now white privilege is something that's deemed a derogatory term to white people, but we need to understand it's not derogatory, it's real. And that's an example of white privilege. If I was in that scenario, I know without a doubt, I wouldn't question in my head that if that man was screaming, "I can't breathe," I know that I can run and probably tackle that officer off of the man, and the worst that's going to happen to me, maybe they hit me, beat me, whatever, grab me, cuff me, but I know that the chance of me getting lethal action taken upon me is very slim. Now, the people that were recording, African American, they have to think differently. They have to second guess that. They have to think, I can't run at that officer, because if I run at an officer, I'm getting shot.
Yeah.
That is, honestly, for lack of better terms, that is the underlying issue of what's going on. So this is something that has been going on. So because of that...
Another thing I want to point out is, I bet those people who were there, like filming, like in the moment, they probably, like if they could go back, they probably wish that they would have done more. But like a lot of times when you're in the moment and like your adrenaline's going, like it's easier said than done, like looking back, like what it's shoulda, coulda, woulda, really, you know, and like they were, in their defense, they were speaking up and saying, you know, what are you doing? Like,
yeah, they were yelling at the officers,
like, what are you doing? You know, like,
this man can't breathe. Get off of him.
Right, but originally the protests started in Minneapolis, and people were protesting because they wanted all 4 police officers charged for his murder, because originally it was just Derek Chauvin, the officer who had his knee on George Floyd's neck and ended up killing him due to asphyxiation. So it was about justice for George Floyd, and that was kind of like their goal. But in the meantime, the protests, they became riots.
Well, the issue was, when the protests began, the officer had yet to be arrested. Here you have a video of an officer murdering another black man while he was handcuffed on the ground, and he had yet to be arrested. It took 3 days for them to arrest him,
Right.
from what I understand.
And I think that's one thing we should change. Is I know like a lot of times when cops are persecuted, they're persecuted differently from regular civilians, because sometimes in their job they can they have to use force, or they can use force. But if it's something like that that's blatantly, you know, outrageous to say that that deserves some sort of special delay, you know, like I think that's ridiculous. I think in cases like that where it's on video and it's obvious, the police officer should be tried just like a civilian. And I know a lot of times in cases like these, the police officers will sit before a board. They won't sit like in a courtroom before a judge. I think that's another thing we should change with the way we persecute police officers, where there's an injustice, a violent crime that is committed by the police officer, because that badge and that gun doesn't put that cop above the law. And that officer swore when he started his job to uphold the Constitution of the United States and to protect the community. And the problem is we have a lot of cops that are out here and they're doing the opposite. They're really going into the community and causing violence and destruction and hurt and loss of loved ones. So the protest started in that sense that people are fed up, and rightfully so, you know, like
People are fed up of racist cops.
Yeah.
A lot of these police officers all of the police officers that you witness doing this over and over again that are being filmed on camera phones and their dash cams and their body cams, these are racist cops that are taking it to the extreme because they judge a man or a woman on their skin tone. And that is the issue. That has been the issue. And people want to say, you know, a lot of racism it's a disease, in my opinion. It's something that has been going on since the beginning of our history. And that's the problem, is it hasn't. People can say, oh well, after the Civil War and then now look, they all have equality, but they don't have equality, because every single day they have to worry about things that you and I don't have to worry about as a white person. And that's something that, as white people, it's hard for us to grasp that, because we haven't dealt with it. So that's why I can understand how people can have different views on things, but when it comes to something as you want to be on the opposition, you want to be on the opposite side saying, well, no, if they did, I don't believe as white people we have the right to say that. I believe that we have the right to stand up for them and to fight for them because they are our brothers and sisters. We are human. We are a human race. But I don't believe that we have the right to say, well, no, if they would have done, you can't oppose it because we don't know what that's like. We don't know what it's like to be black. And I had somebody tell me one time, and I quickly shut them down, very quickly, with a lesson in history. I had somebody say to me one time, being black in America is no different than being white. I said, first off, yes it is. I'm going to try to limit my cursing. I said, yes it is, first off. Second off, how would you know as a white person? You don't know. But it's different, and that's the issue they've been fighting for. That's the issue they've been protesting for decades. And unfortunately, a lot of the people that get put into positions of power as law enforcement have this homegrown racism that has been passed down through generations upon generations in their families.
Yeah, like I was telling you yesterday, like a couple generations older than us, maybe 3 generations older than us, it was like a lot of people would move to the cities. They would immigrate to America, then move to the cities, and it would be like peaceful. They wouldn't have to really lock their doors, like in the early 1900s, mid 1900s. And then like over time, the minorities started immigrating to America and moving to the inner cities, which were more impoverished. There's less money, more like drugs and gangs and gang violence, which grew over time. So then, generally speaking, the people who were wealthier, who had stayed there,
The white
at
folks.
first, yeah,
Because-
the majority, we'll say that, they moved outward to the suburbs. And so I feel like a lot of times it's harder, or it was harder for people who are like older to not kind of feel some sort of like stereotypical animosity towards the minorities. Kind of like, well, you know, like look at how peaceful things used to be, like in our neighborhoods, and now look like we got all the gangs. And it's hard for them not to tie in like the immigration factor of like where they came from. And unfortunately, like that does get thrown into the mix where they'll mention, you know, it's the blacks and the Mexicans, you know, they came in and now we have all this violence, all these shootings. But I think like that's a vast stereotypical statement or a point to make, because a lot of times I think it's circumstantial, you know, like is that person like committing a lot of crimes and are they like shooting their gun a lot in the street? Then like, yeah, that person's being a criminal, you know, like they have like past criminal history, they have a violent criminal record. But then there's people, they were just born there and they just grew up there, and like maybe they got involved like in sports growing up, like basketball or football, and like you got like these professional athletes who grew up in black communities, or they're minorities who are you know, they play professional sports now. And like that kept them off the streets, kept them away from the gangs. And like that's another point I wanted to make, is if you look at a lot of these professional basketball and football players, you know, they came from rough neighborhoods, and a lot of these rappers, they came from rough neighborhoods, and like they worked their butt off, and now they do a lot for culture, for the community, for like fashion. A lot of good comes from our minority brothers and sisters, and that was one thing I wanted to point out.
Yeah, it's because a lot of those things, fashion, rap, that is black culture, and these people came from these poor, impoverished communities because that's the only place that their ancestors could grow up, right? So let me like explain to people that don't know. When communities first started being built, and the government agencies used to do this, used to lay out a map, and when banks were built, they would give the banks this map, and the government agencies would draw on the map with colors which areas of the community were worth investment, telling the banks, this is where you should spend your money, this is where you shouldn't spend your money. Okay, well, a lot of the white folks were still racist, coming from the whole slavery thing from back in the day, right? So they would redline the poor communities, which were mostly African American communities. So because they were redlining, they would give these maps to the banks, and the banks would not lend these communities any money. So my grandparents were able to get a mortgage loan. Their grandparents could not get a mortgage loan because they were black. That's it. Because the government agencies redlined. It's called redlining. You guys should Google it if you don't know what that is. The government agencies would literally redline those neighborhoods and tell the banks not to lend these people any money. And they would tell the banks, oh, these white communities here, lend them even if they can't pay it back, lend it to them. Give them the money. And that's how they grew up. So they grew up in those communities. So imagine their grandparents being our age, 26, 30 years old. I want to get a house. I want to go to college. The issue is my neighborhood is redlined. I can't get a mortgage to go to get a house. Okay. So not only do we have that, now I can't get any money to live in a nice home. So I live in shitty housing because the bank won't give me the same money as the white boy. So not only that, but now my kids are going to shitty schools. I go to shitty schools. Why do I go to shitty schools? Because the schools are funded by local property taxes. And if your local property tax is shit, the only reason it's shit is because you can't get money to get a nice house. So this whole area, The property taxes are low because the housing is cheap, because they won't invest, the banks won't invest any money into this area. So the property taxes that are going to the schools can only give you a shit school. So now these kids are getting worse education. They don't have any access to tutors, to a lot of after-school activities. So now, on top of that, you have implicit bias. Implicit bias is stereotypes, for lack of a better word, saying black people run fast, white people run businesses, Asian people are smart. That's called an implicit bias. One of the implicit bias is names that sound like they're black names. So not only did the African Americans, when they first started to get a foothold, not only could they not have access to good schooling, not get access to a mortgage loan, now a lot of them can't get a job because their name sounds black, so they wouldn't hire them. This is real. You can look all of this up. This actually happened. So that's what a lot of my grandparents and my grandparents' grandparents and my parents they haven't done their history on it. They haven't done their homework on it. They don't understand what exactly happened. So many white people are so quick to say, well, that's the ghetto over there. Do you know why these people grew up in the ghetto? They couldn't get the money that your mom got.
So you're saying it's because of the socio-economical consequences of what the decisions that the bigwig bankers and government made about who to fund and who not to fund.
It was legal segregation.
There was bad cultural outcomes from this, which influenced the African American community to become the way it became, with like jobs and education, and schooling and stuff like that. So then, like, what do you have to say to the people who say that, well, we do have plenty of equal employment opportunity businesses that are willing to employ these young African Americans, but then, like, sometimes, not all the time, sometimes, like, African American will get a job and it'll be decent paying, but then, like, they're calling in, like, a lot, and they're just not really caring. So, like, would you say that, like, the reason that, like, a lot of times that can be the case is because of, like, the way they were brought up, just, like, in a rough neighborhood, and, like, they didn't really have the schooling, and, like, they weren't really, like taught, like, about, like, you know, like, working in that way.
Yeah.
Like, the importance of, like, attendance. And
that's, like, hard for me to say as a white person, but my personal opinion would just be they never saw America care enough about them to invest in them. If you're not going to give my family money to get a house, if you're not going to give us a nice enough school that we can't get because our property taxes are low, if you won't give me the same loan that you give this man that is working the same job as me, then I can't go to school. If my grandparents can't get accepted to this college because of legal segregation that was happening at the time, then we can't get the same education that the white people can get. Now it's getting much better now. But I'm saying I'm resorting back to history. This is why a lot of people grew up in these rough areas, is because that's the only thing that they were allowed to grow up in. In cities like Detroit, they used to have like 6 to 8 foot walls separating white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods. I mean, you know, like,
the reason I wanted to bring that up is because I feel like for a lot of people, like, it's hard for them to keep an open mind and see, like, the stance that you're making and the argument you're making, because they were brought up differently.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they went to college, you know, like, they have the job or the business, you know, they work 50 to 70 hours per week, and in their mindset, it's like, you know, like, I'm over here, like, grinding my butt off, you know, like 60, 70 hours per week, only so that the overtime that I put in will get taxed more, and then, like a decent amount of those tax dollars will go towards people on unemployment, and those people, like, aren't working. It's like, so then they say, like, how is that fair? Like, we have equal employment opportunities here, and we can work hard. If we want a better life for ourselves, we can create that better life. But I see, like, it's like the stance you're taking is that they had socio-economical consequences given their circumstances, so therefore they were raised differently, they were brought up differently, they weren't taught the same things that those people who have a hard time seeing their stance were taught when they were growing up. So I think that's an important discussion to have, and it's a sociological discussion, really.
It is.
Different cultures, different neighborhoods, how we fund certain neighborhoods, how we tend to view, how our worldview is, depending on how we were raised, how we grew up.
But even today, implicit bias is still real. So they've done studies today that show that a person with a white sounding name and a person with a black sounding name that have the exact same resume, the white dude that has a white sounding name gets twice as many callbacks. That's called implicit bias. That's called white privilege. And that's not something we should take offense to. That's something that we should fight with them for. If Ethan and Jamal have the same exact resume, we went to the same school, we get the same GPA, we're applying for the same positions, we put in 15 applications to the same places, I'm going to get 10 callbacks and he's going to get 3.
Yeah.
That's real. And
that's exactly what I'm saying. Like how people have a hard time, thinking about this with an open-minded approach,
right?
Where they can see the stance that you're making about.
And that's what I fight for, because I'm sensitive, I'm passionate, and it breaks my heart because I am very open-minded and I can see, I see it happen. I have a few African-American friends that have told me some of their struggles they've faced growing up, things that they've had to experience that I haven't even had to think about experiencing. And because of that, I listen, I read, and I understand what's going on. So, that's the only thing that, I can say to those of you who disagree with me or get enraged when somebody says Black Lives Matter. I can just say, I implore you to do your research and to deploy empathy, because you have to understand that as much as you want to say, slavery has nothing to do with them. That's what a lot of people, as much as you say that, you have to understand that you just don't know what it's like. No, these people and these people's parents weren't slaves, but they're still feeling the repercussions of slavery.
Right.
It's real. It's still happening today, and that's what they're fighting for. They're fighting for equality.
I feel like another thing in America that we tend to do is we tend to use the media to influence the way people think about certain issues, and we tend to politicize things highly. And we're already seeing change within our communities, which is great. A lot of communities are talking, I know LA specifically, they're speaking of defunding the police and funding more black communities.
The mayor of Los Angeles took $150 million out of the police budget, out of the law enforcement budget, and gave it to the black low-income areas, communities, right. The communities.
But then we have the concern, like we saw on the news last night, Fox News, I'll throw that out there. Their stance is more the counter stance that I was expressing earlier, is that they kind of look at it more kind of closed-mindedly, well, if we're defunding our police and we're funding these communities more, then that shows that the criminals, have more power than the people who are supposed to be protecting and upholding our communities right now. So their concern would be that if we do fund these neighborhoods with minorities, that we're taking power away from authorities who are there to protect the community and to serve the community, and therefore those authorities will no longer be able to effectively serve and protect the community as they were before. So that's kind of where it becomes complex, because you can't just say the whole black community is just criminals, because that's extremely stereotypical and that's pretty racist, really. Because
okay, but let me pause you there real quick. So if somebody wants to say that, or if people say, well, they're slinging drugs and guns, let me put something into perspective for those of you that are so stuck on that, right? If your family grew up in an area that was legally redlined and you couldn't get money to go to good schools, you couldn't get money to live in nice houses, you had implicit biases against you that you literally couldn't get a job. If you can't get a job and you need food, what are you going to do? You're going to learn how to make money outside of getting a job. What do? You can do skill trading. You could do working on cars, or people can literally teach you. Like, that's maybe how, I don't necessarily know, but maybe that's how this got the whole like drugs and thing got into those communities. These people couldn't get jobs because of what their name sounds like. These people couldn't get loans because of their area in the map was redlined by these government agencies. So what do? You got to sell drugs to put food in your cabinet, bro.
Or maybe they were raised by people who were addicted to drugs, and they never really were taught like right and wrong, like in that way. Or maybe they didn't even have parents.
But what if you can't get a job? Let's say you're Jamal. Let's say Jamal's applying, and Jamal can't get no jobs because his name is Jamal, maybe. Or you can chalk it up to whatever you want. But for some reason, Jamal can't get a job. Ethan and Blake can get a job, but Jamal can't get a job. And Jamal's mom is delivering pizzas because she didn't get to go to school because she didn't get the same opportunities as other people. So when it comes to that, you got to do what you got to do. And that's why I never judge anybody for doing stuff like that, because and a lot of people say, well, just go get a job. Well, maybe nowadays there's a lot more equal employment opportunities like that. But when this originated, they didn't have those kind of opportunities.
Right.
Think about that. What if they didn't have the same opportunities as you and I because they didn't?
And another thing I want to point out is it don't matter if you're black, brown, white, yellow, purple, green, or blue. If you finally get a job and you don't want to work, you're not going to keep that job if you keep calling in. And I feel like that happens sometimes too. Like sometimes it's not that they can't find a job or they can't get a job because there's unfair bias, which there are unfair biases. Like, I'm not denying that, but I'm saying like sometimes maybe it's they're not looking hard enough, or maybe once they finally get that job, they're not trying hard enough. And like I feel like that goes for everyone across the board. Like I'm not saying that's just like something that pertains to like your culture or the color of your skin or anything like that, but that's kind of like common sense.
Right.
So,
but what really gets me is like, the main reason I stand so firm on this is that recently, since the whole thing with George Floyd sparked up, I took it upon myself to, I understood where I stood, and I was with the black community, as this has been an issue for a long time. Excuse me.
We spoke about it in a previous podcast.
It's been an issue for a long time, and it's something that is long overdue to be addressed, but I never really understood where it originated. So I took it upon myself to do more research, to study more, to learn more about the history of America, so that way I could deploy more empathy and I could understand exactly where this might have originated. And so because of that, I learned a lot about the history of America. And I think a lot of the people, I'll just say a lot of racist white people, I think a lot of the issue with a lot of racist white people, other than the fact that it was just passed down through generations, is that they haven't done their homework on the history of America. So because of that, I want to give a really quick breakdown for anybody that's listening that might be curious, or like, you know what, I don't know a lot about that because I took history classes, obviously, but they didn't. What you got? Oh. So they said I took history classes, but I didn't necessarily remember much of that, because in school they have us memorize things, right? And then we take a test over it, and then after that we just forget about the shit. So let me give you a quick rundown of the history of America, okay? So like, at least from as much research as I have done. So, and now I'm not talking like Christopher Columbus type dudes, right? Like, I'm talking in the early 17th century, about 1610 to 1620 is when I understand this happened. You have a group of pilgrims that sailed to America on the boat called the Mayflower. Now, y'all remember what the Mayflower is, right? Maybe you don't remember what it is, but you remember that name. Oh, the Mayflower. Yeah, I remember I had to memorize that shit in school, right? So the Mayflower sails to America with these pilgrims. The reason that they came to America was a promise of land and gold that they had heard, and they were rebelling against like the English religious system, whatever. They just wanted to be able to practice whatever they wanted to and have their own land. And they said, screw it, we're going over here. Now, you got to take what I'm telling you with a grain of salt, because it's coming from me, and if y'all know me, I'm just going to kind of like summarize it. to the best of my ability. So these pilgrims come here 1610 to 1620. There's like 110 of them on the Mayflower. Now, throughout that voyage, only about 80 of those 110 of them make it to America. We got 80 of them. They land right at the beginning of winter. Now, winter's going on, and because winter's going on, we don't know how to provide for ourselves. Our white ancestors don't know how to provide for ourselves. We don't really know how to hunt, how to get food, how to plant corn. So, out of those 80 people, midway through winter, half of them die off. So now we've got 40 white people here in America that are pretty much like, what am I going to do? Now, who comes to the rescue? Like I said, take this with a grain of salt, because I'm just kind of like putting it in my own terms. So who comes to the rescue? The Native Americans do, whose land it technically was before us, okay? This is Native American land. The Native Americans see us, they literally save our asses, teach us how to hunt, teach us how to get our own food, teach us how to grow corn. And so now, these group of pilgrims who, there's only 40 of them left, one of which was William Bradford. That was one of them. So I don't know if you guys remember that name from school, but this is why you should remember his name. William Bradford was in this kind of first group of the pilgrims that came here. Out of these 40 people, William Bradford, the Native Americans say, hey, instead of you being on our land and we're going to kill you because you're on our land and you could take some of our food and we need it to survive and we don't want you here, they're welcoming people, and they say, we're gonna teach you how to survive, and we're gonna share this land with you. So they share the land with us. Long story less long, we make it through the winter. These 40 pilgrims make it through the winter, and now we're flourishing. We have learned how to get our own food. We've learned how to make corn, and because of that, we tell the Native American tribe, who consisted of Squanto. You remember Squanto? That name Squanto?
Yeah.
Yeah, but you don't remember.
It's a movie too.
But you don't remember why you remember it, right? You just remember the fucking name. This is why I'm telling y'all, because they weren't able to penetrate this to us in grade school because they didn't know how to reach kids' hearts. Okay, so Squanto was in that Native American tribe that saved our asses with William Bradford and his homies, right? So Squanto, we invite Squanto and all of his homies, like 90 of them, the legend says, like 90 of them to this feast. Hey, you taught us how to survive, you taught us how to get food, now we're going to have a feast and we're inviting you to it. Hence Thanksgiving. This is how Thanksgiving began. This is where Thanksgiving originated. So thank you, Squanto and the Native Americans, right? Okay. Now there's another group of people that come from the British colonies and whatnot. These people land in what was called Jamestown, Virginia. And instead of getting help from the Native Americans offered to help them there too. This is around the same time span, about 1610 to 1620. Instead of taking help from the Indians, one of our white ancestors, his name is John Smith. You remember that name? Probably do. This is why you remember it, okay? John Smith didn't want to take help from the Indians. Too proud, too stubborn. This dude is like a battle warrior, a fighter, right? I don't need help from the Indians. We'll just starve. And they damn near did starve. They started stealing corn from the Indians. Well, he got caught up. And one of the chief of that Native American tribe was Chief Powhatan. His daughter, Pocahontas. You remember the Disney movie that we don't remember what the fuck happened in the movie? This is what happened. Chief Powhatan and his, I might be like not pronouncing that name right, his daughter Pocahontas. We stole the corn from them, and they caught John Smith taking the corn, right? They capture him, and they go to kill him, right? And there's a quote from John Smith back in the day that's been passed down, obviously, and says, I'll butcher it if I try, but pretty much they had his head up against two rocks, and they were about to just smash his brains out, right? Pocahontas steps in, and she says, "No, Daddy, I like him. Don't kill him. I like him. He's a nice white boy." They let him go. He runs off, and from my understanding, doesn't go back to his tribe, doesn't hang out with Pocahontas and marry Pocahontas like she wanted him to. He just takes off, never to be heard from again, from my understanding, at least from the extent of my research. So now, Pocahontas ends up marrying another one of those white dudes, another one of our white ancestors. So now we've got two groups of our white ancestors, John Smith and his homies. Then you got William Bradford and his homies, who had the Thanksgiving with Squanto and them. two groups of them that are now flourishing in two different areas of America. Here's the issue. The issue arises when the Indians teach us how to make tobacco. The first thing that jump-started the American economy, tobacco. We send it back to our homeland. The people in our homeland say, oh shit, this is some good stuff right here. We're coming over there for that. Enter the Great Migration. That's when the Great Migration took place. All of these people here, oh, there's tobacco over there. Wow, this stuff is serious. Like, if they got that over there, they probably have gold. Plus, they have a promise of land. Let's go. So they all come over here. This is the Great Migration.
They want a better life, so they all start coming over here. They know our economy's booming. They know things are going really well.
Yeah, not our economy, the Native Americans' economy that they're sharing with us.
I meant the economy over here.
Right, yeah. So this is the Great Migration. Google this shit. They all come over here. Now the issue is, William Bradford and his homies with Squanto are doing great. John Smith and his actually John Smith is gone. All the homies, I can't remember the guy that married Pocahontas, but it was another white man, right? And everybody's doing great. The issue is, all of our other ancestors come over here during the Great Migration, and they decide, we want this land. And the Indians say, okay, we'll share it. We'll split it, we'll share it. And they say, no, we want this land. And then Chief Powhatan has a famous quote that says, why would you take by force what you can have by love? But that's not how they operated. That's not how they thought. They didn't think, oh, let's just share it. They wanted it all. They just wanted everything for themselves, for lack of a better word. And they decided, if these Indians aren't going to give us all of the land and leave, we're just going to kill them for it.
Not only that, they did awful things to them, to their wives and daughters. And
terrible things. So now you've got, put this into perspective. Our white ancestors literally got saved by the Native American tribes of Squanto, invited them to a Thanksgiving, and now we're killing them. And even William Bradford, who was so thankful and had that Thanksgiving for those Native Americans, when it came to land, he was willing to do what he felt he had to do for his people, even if that meant murdering Squanto and his people. And that's exactly what they did. They killed off the Native Americans. They stole their land. Now, they're living on stolen land, and not only that, so if that isn't messed up enough and make you not want to celebrate Thanksgiving anymore, not only that, but you got all these white people here now, and now they start fighting each other for the land. Enter the 7 Years' War between the British and the French, right? Well, the French had a lot less people. So when the French knew they had a lot less people and they were probably going to get killed, what did they do? Pause. Let me rewind a little bit. In 1619, the first terrible decision by our maybe not the first terrible decision, a very terrible decision, the start of something terrible happened. 1619, they brought over the first ship of 20 African slaves in 1619 to work these fields of tobacco. So the Indians teach us how to make tobacco. We kill the Indians. We say, cool, we know how to make tobacco, we know how to provide food for ourselves, but we don't want to do all the work. So they bring over a ship of 20 African slaves in 1619, and they have them work the fields of tobacco. They're doing all the work. And then from then on, they just keep bringing ships and ships of African slaves, and that's where slavery began. That's how slavery began. So now that the 7 Years' War, so fast forward back to the 7 Years' War here. Now that the 7 Years' War is ensuing, the British and the French know that the British, from my understanding, I believe, that the British are highly outnumbering them. So the French tell the slaves, if you fight with us, you can have your freedom if we win.
Dude, I'm thoroughly impressed. I just want to say that, like, you need to go to school for history, because like you remember everything,
bro. Like,
and I'm over here like, how does he know all this? Like,
I've been reading. It's not from school.
Right.
It's not from school. They didn't teach me well enough. These are things in school that they might have taught us, but they didn't really put it in these good of terms. But I decided to take it upon myself when this George Floyd thing happened to do more research and to understand, because I wanted to know the history of America. Because I've always heard we're living on stolen land, and then we had slaves. I know these things. I've heard these things, but I didn't really understand the history of it. So I decided to take it upon myself to do the research. So that's what I've been doing literally for like the past 2.5 weeks, is researching this stuff. So 7 Years' War. The French have a lot less people. They tell the slaves, hey, if you fight with us, we need you. If you fight with us and we win, you can have your freedom. The problem was they didn't win.
Duh.
The British end up making the French flee from America. The good thing is that's how a lot of slaves got away. That's how a lot of slaves got out.
They left with the French.
They left with the French. They went to different colonies. They said
they went back to France.
They said, "Fuck this shit! Like I'm getting out of here!" Right? So you have to understand, as a white person, that you like if you were raised with this, with somebody in your home. Think about who taught you to say, "Oh, that's a black dude. Stay away from him." Think about who taught you that. And now you need to understand with what I just told you, with my very brief description of the beginning of American history. Think about this. Our white ancestors came here, stole land from the Native Americans who literally taught us how to survive. Me and Blake may not be here if they didn't teach us how to survive. We are living off the land that we stole from them, murdered them for, and then we had slaves do the work for us, African slaves do the work for us, and build the American economy. That was just tobacco. And then once cotton got introduced, it was the same thing. So this is why all of this pent-up aggression is still with the African Americans. You can't say, well, they didn't have to experience slavery. It doesn't matter. The repercussions are still to this day. If they do the history, they understand. Listen, we built this shit. Okay? We did all the work for y'all while you sat on your ass and you just fought people taking over more land, murdering more people to take over more land, murdering your own people, getting in more battles and more fights and more wars. And that's the origin of all of it. So then people want to say, well, the riots are just a bad way of doing it. Okay, but what is peaceful protesting doing? And let me tell you something real quick. Another little, very, very, very quick, brief description of history, a little history lesson is rioting is not new. The first recorded riots were when the Stamp Act of 1765 was passed. And the reason that the Stamp Act of 1765 was passed was because the economy was starting to be real low, because the 7 Years' War cost a lot of money. At the end of the 7 Years' War, we didn't have hardly any money. How are we going to make any money? The government decided, okay, we're going to pass this Stamp Act and make people pay extra money. And a lot of people didn't like that shit, so they start rioting. Right. We're not trying to pay extra money. They start throwing, you can look this up. They're throwing bricks. They're burning buildings. This has happened.
And I just want to say another thing. I think one of the reasons this situation is kind of more complex than most people realize is I feel like the rioters and the looters oftentimes are the bad eggs within the group of protesters.
Right. There's
who
some
end up
bad apples
resorting
in there.
to violence, resorting to looting. But then there's also a group of people that you won't hear about from right-winged media who stayed peaceful the whole time. And also a lot of times we need to be open-minded, because a lot of times we're seeing that cops, the police force, are the ones who are resorting to violence first. Mm-hmm. We've seen videos of cops loading bricks into the back of vehicles and taking these pallets of bricks and just leaving them in random areas in the city. And I think maybe that could be like as a means of baiting them to resorting to violence, because then authorities then they have a reason to crack down now. If there's enough chaos and enough violence, authorities might want that to take place first, so then they can enforce more laws, more rule, more control over the people in the long run. So I just wanted to point out that, like, from my perspective, being a born-again Christian, to me it's more about right and wrong. Mm-hmm. So like, I feel like there's a way we can rightly do this, and I stand 100% with the peaceful protesters, because I have a lot of brothers and sisters in Christ who are African Americans too, and I think we can do this, we can do it peacefully. And I think violence is wrong, I think racism is wrong, I think looting is wrong. I think there's just a whole lot we have to take into consideration, and to me it's more about right versus wrong, and I think we should stand up for our African American brothers and sisters, because it's not right and it's unjust that they have to face discrimination the way they do in this world.
And it breaks my heart. It really breaks my heart to the point where, like, I could almost cry sometimes thinking about it, because I think when I see stuff like that, I think about my friends. I try to put myself in the position of, if that was my loved one, if that was my friend Jody, if that was my friend Julius, if that was one of my friends that happened to, I would break down. I would be so furious that I'd be out there burning those buildings with them, bro. Like, because it's almost like you wouldn't even think about, like, bro, I don't care who owns this building. Like, screw you guys. We need help. And so, like, how long do you want them to stand out with signs in front of the White House?
And here's another point where it gets complex. That very building that could be burning could belong to one of their African American brothers who's also a minority within the community, who has faced discrimination his whole life
and fought to get there,
who has grown up and had to deal with being turned down for all these job offers, and he had to deal with that his whole life, and it made it even harder on him. And now who's going to replace his small family-owned business? Maybe he didn't have insurance to cover, you know, arson or riots. You know, most people don't have riot insurance. I don't even know if that's even a thing.
I don't know, it might be.
But now it's like he worked his whole life to get that, and now unfortunately these things are happening. And also African Americans will be working as like security guards, like you saw in St. Louis. A retired police chief who's African American got shot by looters who we think they were involved with the protest, but we don't know. That's kind of another one of those points where it's like complex, you know, like
I think
were they protesting, were they not, were they taking advantage of the protests, but they were just out to get some TVs? Like these are the questions that we need to be asking, like we need to be open-minded about, because if you just take one extreme point of view to the left 100%, to the right 100%, like both sides have a lot of problems, and that's why it's hard. It's almost impossible for you to voice a stance or an opinion without being accused of being a racist, or without being accused of vice versa. Like, oh, okay, well, if you're to the right, you must be a racist. If you're to the left, then you support violence, and that's not necessarily true.
Right.
These issues are a lot more complex, and they involve a lot more people, a lot more problems that we need to talk about and we need to acknowledge.
And like Blake said, I think it's a lot to do with there's, you know, in every group you're going to get some bad apples. So that's what happens a lot. And it could be something where you see people taking advantage of these situations. Oh shit, bro! Like, look, they're all looting and getting the new Off-Whites. Let's go out there and get some TVs from that pawn shop, bro. I know he's not out there. And then somebody, you know, it could just be some people taking. I think it's like Blake says. I think it's wrong to immediately tie that into, well, that's all the protesters. See what they're doing? They're looting those places. They just killed that man.
And that's exactly what right-wing media is doing right now. They're saying a group of looters from the protest ended up killing a retired police chief. Well, first of all, can we prove that they came from the group of peaceful protesters?
Right.
Like, can we prove that's where they started to begin with? Because maybe they knew about the protests going on, but they didn't even partake, and they just took advantage of the protests going on and decided, well, you know, that's what everyone else is doing. You know, the cops are busy over there. You know, let's just kind of go over here. And unfortunately, one of their African American brothers was fatally shot and killed. And, you know, someone's grandfather was killed. And
that's the thing. Like Blake said, it's just like with all of this going on, if you're so quick to jump on a side, it's important to just have an open mind. You just need to question. I heard once, question everything that you know for a fact. That's somebody told me that once. I can't remember. It might have been Ty Lopez.
Right.
Question everything that you know for a fact, because there's a chance you could be wrong. If you think that this is this, do some research on it.
Right.
Do a little digging yourself. Don't be just so quick to listen to who told you that or listen to what media company told you that.
Right.
Do a little digging yourself. Educate yourself. You know?
And I think the people who are concerned about, you know, the cops being defunded and being able to effectively protect the community, I feel like that is a real concern that a lot of people have. And like, I feel like we need to be open-minded about their point of view as well, because, you know, you see a lot of gangs, a lot of violence in inner cities, and they want to make sure that if they go to call 911, that the cops will be able to effectively respond, you know? So, like, whenever you hear that, you can't just say, oh, well, that's a bunch of garbage, you know? Like, of course, like, a lot of times, like, super right-wing people will be, like, a little more, like, closed-minded about things like that. But, like, I also want to point out that we got to have balance, you know? Like, we can't just, like, take everything away from the cops and give it to the inner cities, because if we do that, you know, now, like, the cops can't protect us the way that they're supposed to be protecting us. But then if we do the other way around, we'll have a fascist state like the Gestapos in Germany in the late 1930s. And we definitely don't want, which we do right now, have pretty much a police state.
I think that the African Americans' argument would be the cops have never protected me. They've never been protecting me. I can grow up in this low-income area, and the cops know
but then
that I live in this
you
area.
have to ask, is the person who's saying that, are they out committing crimes, selling drugs, and resorting to violence and shooting it? Because they're always going to feel like the cops are after them to begin with. Like, if they're doing those things to begin with, then yeah, the cops want them. Like, the cops want them in jail. And that's kind of like where it gets complex, where we have to keep an open mind. Because,
Yeah,
like,
and that's where it goes back to, like, the beginning of this conversation where I was saying that's why me and Blake wanted to come on here and say our parts and let people know where we stand, and that we do think that there needs to be a change, but that we also think maybe 2 white kids aren't the ones that should really break this down. You
right,
know?
like it's not really our place.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much like, that's the state of what we're in right now, and it sounds chaotic because it is.
It's really complex, and it's like, it's just you can't really like express an extreme point of view without being accused of some sort of wrong.
And because of the protests, because of things that have been going on in the streets in all 50 states have seen protests for George Floyd and police brutality this go around. All 50 states and 18 other countries have seen this happening and say, we're not taking it no more. There needs to be a change.
And that's why I'm 100% with peaceful protesters. I'm 100% with the Black Lives Matters movement, because Black lives do matter.
Absolutely. And if your argument to that is all lives matter, it's not people saying that all lives don't matter. It's saying we need to focus on the house that's on fire.
Right, and I don't really see that as like an argument or a counter. I see that more as like, well, I'm just gonna like include you in that, and it kind of like covers it, and they kind of like,
yeah,
it's almost like a suppression, like they're pushing it down.
Yeah,
like.
Exactly. And it's like, it was wild because just yesterday I went to my mother's house because I'm in town for the weekend, and my aunt calls my mom, her sister obviously, and my mom's like, Ethan's here, and she puts her on speaker, and she goes, Ethan, because she knows where I stand. I've been posting a lot about this Black Lives Matter and everything, and my aunt says, Ethan, I just want to tell you, all lives matter. And I told her, I said, all lives aren't in danger right now. That's like me saying, let's save the rainforest, and you saying, but what about the forest behind my house? What are you talking about? The rainforest needs saved, not the forest behind your fucking house. It's blooming. They're like, so we had a whole conversation, and I kind of broke down history that she may or may not have known of America, you know, and I try to let, and I think at the end of the conversation, she was a lot more open-minded to what's going on, and she said, well, you know, I just said that because blah, blah, blah. And I said, I understand, I get where you're coming from, but you have to understand that when you say all lives matter, it's almost a protest to their protest. So it doesn't necessarily make sense. It sounds like you're being insensitive, which is exactly what you are being. I feel like,
right.
And I feel like that's kind of the whole theme of this podcast for me and Blake, is just be open-minded.
Right, and whether they intend for it to be like as an insensitive opposition or not, it doesn't matter, because like people are going to take it that way,
right,
when you say that. So we need to acknowledge like how those people feel when we say things like that.
Yeah.
And we need to stand with them like 100%, like, because all men were created equal, and we ought to start acting like it. So cops, quit killing black people, quit killing people in general if they're unarmed.
Quit beating,
not dangerous. Quit viciously beating people with baseball bats and batons.
Quit pulling black people over because they got a tail light out, and then ripping them out of their car and beating them.
And I think if that subject, as they would say, isn't resisting or being violent, then I think 100% that cop should be tried for battery.
Absolutely.
That cop should be tried for whatever it is they did. Assault, battery, murder.
Yeah.
Just like a regular civilian. I think we need to change our laws, and we need to stop protecting the cops so much in situations like these.
It's my belief that that's why the riots began. Because it took 3 days of protesting for them to arrest the man that was on film murdering the man. If we've been protesting for 2 days and you've done nothing, and this man's still outside, like still in his house with 100 officers protecting him, we're gonna start burning shit. We're gonna start, because once you mess up the money, then the government says, oh, hold on a second, what's going on? Sometimes you just gotta mess the money up and get your point across, and they say, okay, now okay, let's go arrest him. And now to this day, to bring you guys up to speed, it's been, how long, 2-3 weeks?
Yeah.
People still protesting a lot, which is beautiful. The peaceful protest, beautiful. And the officer, the main officer, has been, originally was charged with 3rd-degree murder, and has been upgraded to 2nd-degree murder. And the other 3 officers...
And also manslaughter.
Yeah.
Charged with too.
And the other 3 officers were charged with aiding and abetting murder.
He actually has 2 murder charges he's facing from the case right now, 2nd degree and 3rd degree. And that way, like, if they can't acquit him, or if they can't charge him with prove him guilty with the 2nd, then he'll be hit with the 3rd in the manslaughter. Like, I don't. The prosecutor spoke on it, and he said, or the attorney general said that was the quickest he's ever prosecuted a police officer, was the guy who murdered George Floyd. And I know that the case right before he was hit with 2nd-degree murder was handed over to another prosecutor, and he said that he wanted to handle this case appropriately, and he didn't want to rush things from pressure and like mess it up, you know,
right.
Or like they couldn't. There's something they would find, you know, a loophole in the way he was charging the cop, and, you know, mess it up, and it would just be a crap show from there. So
more is to be unfolded, and more peaceful protests are to be had. There was just one in our hometown today. I was unaware of it. I forgot about the woman who cut my hair the other day told me about it, and I forgot. It took place in like the middle of the day, pretty much, right? Yeah.
Shout out to THPD, man. I thought it was pretty cool to see an image from a video of Terre Haute police officers actually in front of the crowd, escorting the crowd with their lights on, and that shows that the THPD stands with the people.
That was beautiful, man.
I heard that they showed a lot of love, nothing but love and respect, and I wish we saw that more throughout our country.
So that's pretty much probably as far as we're going to talk about this right now. We'll keep you guys posted. Maybe we can do an episode every weekend. And I come home almost every weekend now, so we'll keep you guys posted. That is the re-up of a Talk to Remember podcast, the best named podcast in the world. And we're going to come back at you. And once Blake gets more stuff on the walls and everything, we're going to have another cool backdrop like this one. It kind of faded. You can't really see it right now. It went dim. But we were killing it with this. So just know we're coming back at it, guys. And we appreciate you guys all for watching, listening. Hopefully you learned something from this. Hopefully you enjoyed this podcast. And we just ask that no matter what side you're on or whatever, we just ask you be open-minded, okay?
Yeah, and we hope you guys enjoyed it. And we try to voice considerations that often get overlooked. We try to voice the complex situations within the major issue, and we try to bring that to the surface and discuss those things because we feel that's important in times like these.
Absolutely.
So,
it's important for us to show our support, but it's also important for us to understand that 2 white kids aren't the people that should break this apart. But we stand with y'all.
Right.
We love you guys.
God bless you guys.